Welcome to the Financial Integrity Hub's podcast. The Financial Integrity Hub pioneers research and explores how law and governance strategies can be designed, implemented, and enforced to support anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing. This podcast is proudly sponsored by Identity, a RegTech providing financial institutions assurance that they are meeting AUSTRAC reporting obligations. The platform allows regulated entities to gain visibility over transactions, improve auditability, automate manual processes, and reduce the risk of non-compliance. Your host is Isabel Nicholas. Isabel is a researcher at the Financial Integrity Hub. She teaches financial crime at Macquarie Law School and interviews global and domestic experts on trends and market insights for the podcast.
Sanctions are economic measures taken by one country or a group of countries to exert pressure on another country or government. They can take various forms, including trade restrictions, financial penalties, travel bans, and asset freezes. In response to Russia's war on Ukraine, a broad multilateral coalition, including the United States, the European Union, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, Japan, and others, imposed sweeping new sanctions on Russia. The sanctions, unprecedented in terms of scope, coordination, and speed, target the overseas wealth and economic activity of Russia's elites and decision-makers. The sanctions also target Russia's financial and energy sectors, access to Western technology, among other financial and trade tools. In today's podcast, we discuss the objectives of these sanctions, their compliance with international law, their humanitarian impacts, and their effectiveness. Today we're joined by Dr Anton Moiseienko, a transnational crime and sanctions expert who is here to offer his views on the sanctions imposed by the EU against Russia amidst the war in Ukraine. Thanks for joining us today, Anton. I'll start by asking, what are the sanctions imposed and what are the objectives of sanctions against Russia?
Thanks for having me, Isabel. So there's a broad swathe of sanctions that have been imposed by the EU and indeed other countries such as G7 economies, including the United States. And they include two, maybe three broad categories. So there are sanctions against Russia as a state, and that would include, for example, the freezing of the Russian central bank's foreign currency reserves. Then there are restrictions that are sectoral, so those relate to specific sectors of Russia's economy. For example, a bunch of defense and technology companies were sanctioned by the West, which means that they cannot transact with businesses in countries that imposed those sanctions. And then finally, there are sanctions that are targeted against individuals. So those would be members of the Russian regime, broadly understood. So that would include, for example, hundreds of people who form part of the Russian parliament that approved the invasion of Ukraine. So there's a very broad range of measures that have been taken, and some of them have rightly been described as unprecedented, including the freezing of the central bank assets. Now, you also asked about the objectives of those sanctions, and this is a vexed matter. There's a lot of disagreement about why exactly those sanctions have been imposed and what they're supposed to achieve. I think the honest explanation is that they're intended to make Russia's life more difficult. Now, that does not sound like a proper policy objective, which is why there's so much debate as to what exactly that would mean. So are we trying to change Russia's behavior? Are we trying to punish it? Are we trying to incentivize people in the ruling classes in Russia to rise up against Putin and somehow tamper his worst instincts? I think the fact of the matter is no one really knows. It's very much in the eye of the beholder. And really what is happening is governments are trying to impose some pain on Russia to ensure that the invasion is not cost-free, while at the same time trying to make sure that insofar as possible, those sanctions don't adversely impact the interests of the countries that impose them. And this is where the whole discussion about Russian gas and energy supplies comes into play.
You mentioned the restrictive measures against the Russian banks and the National Central Bank of Russia. What do those mean in practice?
So it depends on whether we talk about the central bank or the commercial banks. For the central bank, Russia had around $300 billion in foreign currency reserves stashed in different places around the world. And that was part of their effort to sanctions-proof their economy. So they thought, okay, if we invade Ukraine, we're going to be hit with sanctions, but we've got our war chest that we can rely on. Now, the problem is that part of that war chest was deposited in other countries, and therefore it was amenable to being frozen, which is exactly what happened. So other countries now sit on those $300 billion of Russia's foreign currency reserves. This is not going to be returned to Russia for the time being, but the $300 billion question is what actually happens to those assets? Are they simply returned to Russia when some sort of normalization occurs, whenever that might take place? And if that takes place, or can it be taken away from Russia permanently and used, for example, for the reconstruction of Ukraine? Because the order of magnitude in terms of the damages to Ukraine from the war and the amount that has been frozen in Russian central bank assets is roughly commensurate. And so it's natural to think that that should be confiscated from Russia and given to Ukraine, but there are all sorts of legal difficulties there. Now, in relation to commercial banks, a bunch of them have been disconnected from the SWIFT payment network, which means that they find it much more difficult to operate internationally. It's still not necessarily impossible for them, but it is difficult. And I believe there might be a couple of banks that have also had their assets frozen in countries like the United States, although I'm not quite sure on that, and maybe I should be, but that just speaks to the complexity of the sanctions regimes. There are a number of banks that have been impacted by sanctions in different ways, and the primary mode by which that has happened in relation to commercial banks is simply the disconnection from the SWIFT system.
I see. So what are the legal sources of these sanctions? I guess, are the EU sanctions compliant with international law?
Yeah, so effectively what happens is in each country that imposes sanctions, there would be domestic legal authorities that would enable doing so. So, for example, in the United States, that would be the International Economic Emergencies Powers Act, and there would be a range of executive orders. In the EU, the Union itself has decision-making competence in connection with imposing restrictions on transactions with third countries. So the EU has the competency to impose sanctions, at least financial sanctions. And then the situation is a bit more complicated in relation to travel bans. But effectively, sanctions decisions are taken at the EU level. Now, how does that comply with international law? Well, it really depends on the nature of the sanctions. So, for example, let's take SWIFT disconnection as one example. SWIFT is a cooperative that operates under Belgian law. Russian banks have no legal right to be part of that network. Maybe there are some contractual entitlements, but as a matter of international law, in principle, there's no right for them to be connected to that network. So if they're kicked out, that does not really raise any serious issues of international law. Now, if someone's assets are being frozen in another country, that is a different matter. Here you might have issues related to bilateral investment treaties and also the general international law prohibitions on expropriation. And if those assets belong to private parties, you might also have human rights concerns. But so far, I think it's fair to say that those concerns have not been particularly serious. And whenever cases ended up in courts that relate to sanctions against individuals, the courts tend to say, and I'm speaking here especially of the Court of Justice of the European Union, they tend to say, look, these are temporary measures. They don't deprive you of your property rights. The thinking behind sanctions is that at some point you'll get those assets back. It's unpleasant, but it's not punitive. And we're not talking about anything that would attract the kind of due process protections you'd expect, for example, in a criminal trial. So generally speaking, courts have been relatively soft on governments when it comes to imposing sanctions.
What are some other of the humanitarian impacts of the sanctions?
Yeah, here we've got to distinguish between two aspects of sanctions. So there are human rights issues in terms of the impact on specific individuals. And as I said, people do go to courts and challenge sanctions all the time, and they don't get very far in doing so. But then there's the broader problem of humanitarian impact, which basically relates to people in countries that are heavily hit by sanctions and how they live and what impact sanctions have on their well-being. So, for example, if imagine that hypothetically speaking, Russia was entirely cut off from business from the rest of the world and could not procure goods and medicines and other necessary supplies, it's easy to see how that would lead to a deterioration in the living standards of the Russians. But I think so far that has simply not happened. There has been some impact in terms of the Russian economy, but I don't think that we have seen a vast-scale suffering on a par with what has happened in some other countries that were hit by sanctions in the past. For example, Cuba or Haiti at some points in relatively recent history. So the humanitarian impact of sanctions against Russia is something that I think a lot of people will be watching. And if sanctions get more effective, it might be a bigger concern. So far, it's simply not on top of the agenda because of how things have played out so far. Now, if there was an aggravation in terms of the humanitarian effect of sanctions, if we did see widespread humanitarian crises in Russia that were caused by sanctions, then I think some difficult questions would rise to the surface. So how do you balance the effectiveness of sanctions against that collateral damage, as it were? There's no good answer to that, and I think governments would still press ahead with sanctions if Russia continues to do what it currently is doing in Ukraine, but one would have to be cognizant of the unintended consequences.
Certainly. I guess in your opinion, Anton, have these sanctions been effective so far?
Well, yes and no, which is a very unsatisfactory answer. But as I said, there's no clear objective that those sanctions pursue. And some people say that and mean that as a criticism. I don't mean that as a criticism. We all do things in life that don't have a specific, well-defined objective, but we feel they're still, generally speaking, worth doing. It's the same with sanctions. It's one of the few ways in which Russia can be impacted, and the Russian ability to wage war in Ukraine can be undermined to some extent, and Russia can feel the consequences of its actions. So even though Russia is carrying on regardless, and even though the war has not abated in Ukraine, there is an important symbolic aspect to those sanctions. It's, I think, if one were to posit a hypothetical and say, imagine that sanctions were not imposed, imagine that Russia invaded Ukraine and there was no international response of note, and everyone continued doing business as usual with Russia, then I think it's very easy to see how problematic that would be. And I think that in itself is a very strong argument in favor of maintaining and arguably expanding sanctions, even though, as you have alluded to in your question, we don't really know how effective they have been because we don't really know what objective we're trying to achieve.
Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Isabel.
The Financial Integrity Hub's research equips Australia and the international community with the knowledge, tools and insights to understand, identify and disrupt illicit finance threats. If you're interested in seeing more from the Financial Integrity Hub, don't forget to follow us on LinkedIn to see our posts and events. We post a few times each week on breaking news and the latest research. We would like to thank Dr. Doran Goldbarsht for his academic advice and Isabel Nicholas for hosting.